Our next talk will be a pretty interesting one. I know I'm curious to see what they have to say here. I've never seen these two discuss this topic at length before together. We have two local legends. We have Jody Underwood. She has served on the Croydon School Board since 2010. She helped pass a bill in the New Hampshire legislature allowing private schools to be included in town tuitioning agreements. She's a founding board member of the School District Governance Association of New Hampshire. She's written research papers on how New Hampshire uses tax dollars for private schools and about how town tuitioning works in New Hampshire. She's given presentations on town tuitioning and school choice throughout the state. She's worked in technology development to support learning and assessment since 1988. She earned her BS in computer science from Hofstra University, her MS in computer science and AI from Rutgers University, and her PhD in education from the Technion Israel Institute of Technology. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Jody Underwood. This one's for you. We also have her husband, Ian Underwood, another local legend. Ian is a planetary scientist and artificial intelligence researcher who used to work for NASA. He was also the director of the renowned Ask Dr. Math service. He's a co-founder of Bardo Farm and Shaolin Rifle Works. He's a popular speaker at Liberty-related events. He's created a series of books, bare minimum books, which explain in simple terms complex issues like law, education, and gun rights for the average person. Now, these two were involved in, and it's Ian Underwood. Give him a round of applause. These two were involved in one of the most famous libertarian stories out of New Hampshire, and it's the Croydon school budget, and we're going to hear all about it now. So, another round of applause.
And that's his, yeah. Just put that there.
So, and you have the thing to do the slides?
Well, I do.
Okay.
Now I do.
Okay, so we're going to talk basically about what happened, and then we're going to have a discussion, and we want advice basically on what we should have done differently and what the next town should do when they try to pull something like this. I mean,
Wow.
so,
Battery.
oh, we're waiting for that? Okay.
Wow. Do we get more time?
No. Awesome.
Right. So take notes, really, for advice. I mean, I think it's a long story, and we want to give our side, compared to what you've seen in the mainstream media. Although I would say the NBC docuseries was pretty good, but I mean, we had 2 episodes in there. They're each about 13 minutes long. So if you haven't seen it, go take a look. Which was again a fair tale of of what happened, but way short, right? We're not going to get to all the details today, and I'll just tell you now, just because we have time, that we are going to turn this into a book. So one of the bare minimum books. So come by the author's table, and you'll see what the bare minimum books look like that Ian's written. And we'd like to hear, sort of what could we have done differently, and what can other people do to do something like this in their town. And so, but we'll hold that till the end, sort of at the QA part. So just keep that in mind. You got it? Not yet? What happened? Is something locked? Picture, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, we can start. The first slide is just the Croydon Town Hall. And, the story starts, it's just a typical early March day in a typical New Hampshire town. So there's some snow, but not enough, nothing that people haven't seen before. You have a usual size crowd, which for Croydon is about 35 people who show up. And it's not even, it's the usual people. All the same people show up every year because they're there to basically pretend like they have some control over what's going on. And there are no media at this meeting because nothing out of the usual was expected. So they all went to the town meeting in the morning and then they went home. So while they were showing up, the one thing that was different was you come in, I don't know if you've been to a town meeting in New Hampshire, but you come in and you get a card if you're a registered voter, so when they have a vote on something, you can hold it up. So as people came to check in, there was a pamphlet sitting on the table, just an 8-page pamphlet in a box, and people were picking them up and taking them to their seats, so they had something to read while they were waiting for the meeting. The title of the budget was Budget, or the title of the pamphlet was Budget or Ransom. And you can get this. It's published at Granite Rock. You can get it just by going there and searching for Budget Ransom. So it was a usual meeting, right? So the way the meeting always goes is the school board stands up and says that there is a gas bubble, 22,000. No, wait. So the school board gets up and they say, okay, you're going to give us $1.7 million, and this is what we're going to spend it on. And, they allow tweaks during the presentation where people might say, really, would a 2% raise be okay instead of a 3%? Do you really need to give violins to the kids? The interesting thing about that is it's a bottom line budget, so even if the board says, oh, yeah, we'll do that or we'll take that into account, they don't have to, unless the actual amount demanded gets changed.
This is true for any budget in New Hampshire, in any town. It's always a bottom line budget.
Right. So the kinds of tweaks they're looking at, it would change, say, 0.1% of the budget. They're really meaningless, but they give people the illusion that they have some kind of control over what's going on. So everything's going as expected, just what you'd like, and then all hell broke loose. And that's because I stood up and I said this: what we're being asked to vote on today isn't a budget. You all know how a budget works. You're given some amount of money to work with, your salary, your pension, and you find a way to live within those limits. What we're being asked to vote on is a ransom. You also know how a ransom works. You're told that if you don't pay some amount that's being demanded, someone or something will be taken from you. I propose that we amend the amount in Article 2 to reflect a budget. That is, the amount that the voters in the district want to pay, rather than a ransom, the amount that the district officials feel like demanding. So
give them a sentence to process.
Yeah. Budget. So, okay, but what would that number be, right? And people later said, oh, he just pulled a number out of the air, but I didn't actually. I showed these 3 graphs in the pamphlet, and I talked about them. And when you have seen these 3 graphs and understood what they tell you, there is no way to maintain the illusion that how much we spend on schools has anything to do with how well the kids do. We could spend twice as much. We could spend half as much. It would make no difference. And so I made the point that there are a lot of fundamental questions about education. Things like, what is it we're trying to do? Why are those people paying for those people's kids? If we have to prioritize things, what should they be? These are all, questions that never get answered under the ransom model. And I was saying, we can't fix things unless we address those questions, and we can't address those questions unless we spend a lot less money. And so I looked at other schools in other states and made an argument for that, $10,000 per student should be more than enough. And then we have 80 students, so that's $800,000. And so I said, I moved that we change this from $1.7 million to $800,000. I'll just mention, I was a selectman at the time, and that's widely reported as if that has something to do with anything. I was just a taxpayer saying, I am tired of you taking my money and spending on things that we know won't work. So next. So there was, as you might imagine, some heated discussion on this. And at a certain point, there was a vote of 24-11 to amend the warrant article, which is a first step. So it's now we're going to discuss, shall the town raise and appropriate $800,000 instead of $1.7 million? And so there was a lot more heated discussion. And then...
that's fine. I want to save it for when you get there.
And by a vote of 20-14, they voted to appropriate $800,000 instead of $1.7 million, and a lot of people were stunned, including me.
and me.
And the school board. Right? Because so next. Yeah. So the school board didn't ask for this budget. But they had to work with it. That was the deal. Like, this is your budget. And that was said at several, the next couple of meetings. Like, this is your budget. You got to do this. And, so there's Jody having to clean up my mess. But here's the great thing. We actually had a school board, unlike a lot of school boards, that was, 1, up to the task of doing this, and 2, actually willing to embrace it as an opportunity rather than look at it as some kind of catastrophe.
Well, we had to, right? The town voted for this budget, and we needed to come up with a plan. So our first school board meeting was just a few days after this annual district meeting, and we had 3 significant obstacles, and I'll talk about them in turn, but I'm just going to list the 3 obstacles now. First, the administration was, for lack of a better word, useless. 2, a lot of people were pissed. And 3, this all had to be done in public. Why? Because our school board is made up of 3 people, and if any 2 of them get together to discuss or deliberate about the town, it has to be done in public. That's by the right to know laws. So we'll talk about the administration. They were more than useless, actually. The district superintendent, who regularly describes himself as a big ideas guy, said, "I can't imagine how we can do this." And then he literally and figuratively stepped away from the entire process. He and his staff, who normally sit at the front of the room with the school board, sat with the audience. They moved themselves away from it. But worse, they actually tried to prevent us from getting anything done. They made it hard to schedule meetings. They made up rules that weren't true, and we pushed ahead. And in hindsight, we should have fired him on the spot, but we were too busy thinking about this plan. So that's what we did. And I mean, you should just know that this is what an administration is supposed to be used for. The school board shouldn't be doing this because you can't really do it in public. And I'll talk about that in a minute too. This is what they should do. It's kind of like having a board of directors of Intel trying to design the next generation of chips, right? That's just not what should be done.
It just occurred to me, by the way, the sitting in the audience may have actually been that they were anticipating gunfire.
And they wanted to get out of harm's way. Yeah, sure. All right, so the second point is a lot of people were pissed. And the first meeting we had, it just turned into a venting session. And I thought, like, this will be it. We'll give them time to just vent, and then it'll get better. But it never did. And so here are some of the things that they did during this venting session. They blamed the board for the smaller budget. They blamed Ian for slashing the budget. They blamed me for not warning the public ahead of time about what my husband was going to do at the meeting. But that's like asking me, any townsperson could have come to me and told me they were going to do this. I still don't think that was my job to tell everybody in town about it. They claimed it wasn't possible to educate a kid for only $10,000, despite all the evidence to the contrary. But what was interesting to us was none of them took blame for not being at the meeting, for not ever having come to these meetings, and none of them actually read the pamphlet. So they had no idea what was actually proposed. They just saw it as a slash, right? And that includes the administration.
So in the pamphlet and at the school board meetings, I kept standing up and saying, look, we need to address some questions, okay? And the main question we need to address is, what is the purpose of this? Why are we doing this? Because if we don't know what we're trying to do or why we're trying to do it, then we can actually only succeed by accident, which, 50 years of experience shows is not happening. So in my answer, I said, well, there is an answer that we can use to that question. What's the purpose of all this? And it's just this. In order to ensure the preservation of a free government, the state is responsible for providing each educable child with an opportunity to acquire the knowledge and learning necessary to participate intelligently in the American political, economics, and social systems of a free government. Is anybody familiar with that idea? So a lot of people were like, every time I would say it, they'd be like, that's a crazy free stater idea. That's too narrow a view of public education. That's a detriment to society. I was just quoting the state Supreme Court from Claremont 20 years earlier. So you can't get more mainstream than that, but the fact that I was saying it made it a crazy idea.
Point 3, this all had to be done in public. So Croydon school board meetings have always been unusually open and informal. We've always allowed people to contribute to the discussion and, add to what we're doing during these are our business meetings. And so after that first venting meeting, we basically said, no, you can only do public comment during the public comment session. And each meeting, somebody would be like, I can't hear you, or could you explain that better? And once somebody from the audience spoke, everybody felt that they could speak too. And so there was a lot of yelling and so on, and it was very hard. And we didn't have a cop in town, so we didn't have anybody who could contain them. But that's another story. But so really, you can't have working meetings in public. Especially when everybody feels like they can contribute. So you can't brainstorm. You can't freely express opinions about the people who are obstructing the process. You can't, or what might be done to work around them. You can't talk about out-of-the-box solutions to people who want to stay inside the box and will do everything they can to keep us in there. So that was really hard. It's not really the next slide. So in the middle of the first meeting, we had people from sort of both sides, the $800,000 budget and the original budget, that supported both of those. But the ones who supported the $800,000 budget left early because they saw all the vitriol in the audience and how angry everybody was. And it was uncomfortable. And they really just never came back to the meetings. So when the $1.7 million people were there, they would keep insisting that they were speaking for the entire town. But really, they were just speaking for the people who were showing up, which at that point was about 40 people in a meeting. That first one was like 100, and then after that, it was 40.
They were speaking for the people who didn't mind tantrums.
Yeah, sure. And it was impossible to get anything done. And so, quick lessons just for school boards. You should really try to keep your school board meetings as business meetings, like court sessions. They can watch but can't participate, and always save public comment for the end. I don't know if Croydon will ever get there, but there we are. So several times I would attempt to bring the discussion back to education and asking them, why, what are their priorities? What can we do in our plan to try to meet the needs of the parents and the students? And what they talked about solely was sports, extracurricular activities, transportation, job training, daycare, although without actually saying daycare. Where am I going to drop my kids? No one mentioned academic achievement. At one point, the whole room agreed that they didn't know how to provide sports for kids outside of school. I didn't even have anything to say to that. So at some point, we had a public session, not a school board meeting, where we invited people from Prenda and Kai Pods, these are two micro school approaches, to explain how their program worked. And many people were just rude to them as if they had something to do with this. And one person did listen, at least for a minute. She stood up and said, wow, these are great programs that would work really well for my older son, but I don't like how this is being rammed down my throat, so I'm completely against it. And from there on in, she just completely forgot that she thought it was a good program.
So just at that point, it's this idea, you hear this in all the media coverage of this, that Free Staters are trying to force something on other people. And all we were trying to do was say, no, we're trying to keep you from forcing something on us, right? You hear them, oh, I was sick to my stomach sitting in this meeting. It's like, I've been sick to my stomach for 15 years sitting here. You're going to take my $3,000, $4,000, $6,000, and you might as well burn it in the street. Apparently my feelings don't matter. Two of the things that they never talked about under the issue of forcing are, one, so they put in, as you'll see later, they put in a tremendous amount of effort, time and effort and money. Here's what they didn't do. They didn't say, well, geez, nobody's hardly paying any property taxes now because property taxes dropped by 90%. Why don't we ask people to take the money, the ones who like this, and donate the taxes they're not paying? That never came up. The second thing was, I just can't help. What if they had taken all that time and volunteer effort and put it into teaching their kids to read? Then there wouldn't even be a problem, right? Those solutions never came up. It was all about you're trying to force us to stop being able to take your money. And it's like...
And that should have been part of our narrative, that no, you've been forcing us for 15 years. We've been in Croydon for 15 years plus at this point. So we had some discussions through our board meeting about why individualized learning is a good thing for children. I mean, the parents did not actually understand it, even those with multiple kids, which you just have to wonder, right? I mean, I know they get it with their kids, but they couldn't understand it in a school environment. And it really did seem like a good discussion. There were good questions. And I'm a professional in this, right? I understand how people learn. And so I actually had some, I thought, interesting things to say about it. But then, they got it for about a minute. Again, this minute thing just keeps coming back. Really what they wanted was the status quo, as we keep saying. And some wanted to make sure their kids would graduate from the high school they had spent the prior 3 years doing, which, pretty reasonable, right? And they could have asked the board to make an exception for their kids when you hear what the plan actually is, but they didn't. And in the end, they didn't have to. Oops, that's foreshadowing, but all right.
So I only realized as we were putting this all together, I didn't hear it at the time, but when they kept talking about we need sports, we need extracurricular activities, we need our kids to be with their friends all day, what they wanted was not a school at all. What they wanted was a community center. And that would have also been a thing to discuss. Why don't we have a separate community center where kids can go? And then for the 2 hours a day, 3 days a week, we could educate them, and that will cost a lot less. So there's a couple of stories that also came up during all these meetings that just really affected me. One was several parents at different times stood up and said, I hear you keep saying that if a kid can learn to read, then he can read and teach themselves to, anything. I could see how that would work for other kids, but that would never work for my kid. And that just broke my heart in two different ways, because I just thought, oh my God, what would it be like to be a parent who thinks so little of that child? And what would it be like to be a child whose parents think so little of you? It was that just struck me as tragic, and you don't even know how to address something like that. The second is a story, a guy who was a former board member and a mathematics teacher, which is significant. He stood up at some meeting and said, I'm happy to help pay for other people's children. And I'm sitting there and I'm going, okay, so let's say there's a poor box, and with this hand I put $3 in, and with this hand I take $50 out. In what sense have I helped the poor? I haven't. And this is what he's doing. Every year he puts in $3,000 in property taxes and takes out $50,000 in tuition. So, you give him the benefit of the doubt and you think, okay, maybe he thinks that after I'm done paying after my kids are all out, then I'll help. But he's a math teacher, and if you do the math, which is not really that hard, it turns out he would have to pay taxes for 250 years before he would actually start paying anything back, right? It's just, this is the level of whatever mentality that we're dealing with.
Math being taught.
Yeah, math. And I wrote about it. Is I said at least you can be pretty sure that he's not teaching math to your kids.
All right. So, as a school board member, I and another school board member spoke with the Department of Ed, different people in the Department of Ed, to help us understand what our options were. And at one point, and we were focusing on micro schools. This seemed to be the best thing. It's sort of a 21st century kind of thing to do, right? Let's use technology in a good way. So we liked it. And once we attended an informational meeting with a set of Department of Ed staff to help us understand what the limitations were, what was legally allowed, and so on. And it was informative. But then when the townspeople learned that we had done this, they said, that's an illegal meeting. Remember what I said before about two school board members in a room together? It was actually over Zoom, but same difference. So, that's not my understanding of the right to know law. We weren't deliberating. We weren't actually discussing Croydon. We were just talking about the law and getting information from them. But in any event, after the accusation, I posted my minutes the second I could, because the point is to be transparent and open about what you have, but that didn't matter. Now I'm a liar, and I've done illegal things to the town. And at that point, a petition was circulated so my other school board member, we're going to call him Bob. So the petition circulated was for Bob and me to resign from the board now that, we've done illegal things. And they got around 100 signatures, good for them. And at every meeting, they presented the petition and the results and asked us when we're going to resign and when we're going to step down. And then at one meeting, I quoted Marcus Aurelius, and I said, "The opinion of 10,000 men is of no value if none know anything about the subject." So our plan. We're going the micro schools route. And so here's what happens. You basically meet in person and you work with an online curriculum with a professional guide helping you along the way. For the younger kids, there are some physical activities. So Prenda has a lot of experience with this. And Prenda would have met in our Little Red schoolhouse. and Kai Pods were going to be for the other grades, for grades 5 through 12. And we have a K-4 school in Croydon, right? So that's like one of the main things we need. Kai Pods for other grades, where the kids would get to choose their own curriculum, so something that's appropriate to them. They're not limited to a single one. And we hadn't yet figured out where they would meet. And another thing to boot was that both would be completely subsidized by the state in terms of federal funds for the first 2 years, which was pretty cool. In addition, the plan, we would cap our tuition at $9,000 for other schools, for the brick and mortar schools. And the way it works, town tuitioning, because we have a K-4 school, we tuition out all our other kids to neighboring schools, both private and public and religious, in fact, now. But their tuition is about, I'm sort of going off here. Their tuition is, next year is going to be $19,000 per kid for the one of the worst schools in the state. But so for town tuitioning, if we cap our tuition at some rate, the parents pay the rest if they choose a school that's more expensive than that tuition. So now, basically at the $9,000 cap next year, they would have to be shelling out $10,000 from their pockets to pay for the public schools that they would choose. But the $9,000 is actually enough for the private schools, for both Newport Montessori and for Mount Royal, two excellent schools in the area. So they wanted to send their kids to the worst school in the state, but didn't want to. This isn't even time for your comments, is it? But they probably couldn't even afford to pay the rest of that money for those kids.
I do want to point out, though, something that easily got lost and sort of got lost in what she just said, which is she mentioned it's an online curriculum for these things. Online curriculum does not mean online learning. Right, the curriculum is online. You can download it. You can look at it, but all the learning would be face to face.
Yeah, I said they would meet in person. That's right.
But people heard online curriculum and thought, "Oh, online. You're online all day," which could not have been further from the truth.
They thought COVID remote learning. That's what they thought. So that's the plan. And special education, though, is special. So that was the plan for regular ed. Now what do we do for special ed? With the $9,000 cap on tuition, we had enough to cover regular education. So we were prepared to go into deficit spending for special ed for the first year, because after that we would know what the budget would be, what we needed, and we could plan accordingly. And then interestingly, with that 54% reduction in the budget, our tax rate would go down by 90% because of the amount that the state and federal government contribute. And the special ed was only about $135,000. So we would still have had the absolute lowest tax rate in the state with this plan.
Right. I mean, a typical tax bill would go from about $3,000 to $300.
Literally.
And of course, nobody wants to live in a town like that.
So the reaction, they responded with lies. They had multiple mailers to the town that included these lies, trying to get their side. And I'm going to read to you a representative sample because it could go on for a long time, which all will be in the book, by the way. Well, I don't know about all, but you know. But you have to realize that all these meetings after the annual meeting, everything was recorded. So all of these things are a matter of public record. So the lies. The meeting was poorly attended. This will raise taxes. House prices will plummet. They're going to have massive deficit spending. It's like COVID remote learning. They'll close Little Red. This was a coordinated effort by the members of the FSP to undermine public education. I love this one. Ian is a leader of the Free State Project. And no, this one's the best one. Ian made it snow so people wouldn't show up to the annual meeting. And so that some of them, so many of them weren't even clever lies, right? You all heard, with the counters to these. And so how did nobody see through these things, right? Not nobody, right? But that group of people.
Okay, so it turns out at the first several meetings, it was the business administrator was saying, look, this is your budget. It's $800,000. And then somebody, probably funded by the NEA, found a statute, which had maybe never been used. But it turns out a town can hold a special meeting to amend the budget passed at the annual meeting. However, there is a very high bar here. And that is that if there's a number of people who are registered at the time of the first vote, and at least half of those people have to cast votes in order for the vote to be binding, right? Even if it's yes, no, the number of votes is what counts. And we had never even had that many people in any kind of election, any kind of meeting, so it just seemed like that wasn't going to happen. And so I sent out a mailer at my expense, and I basically told people, look, if you like the budget, stay home, right? Because then they won't have a quorum, and it's not an issue. So 283 is the number. That was the number. If fewer than 283 people showed up, then...
if 283 people didn't cast ballots, you could show up,
yeah.
but cast ballots.
Yeah.
Then it wouldn't be a valid vote, and we would have the $800,000 budget.
So, next slide. So, this is just me paying for it, and I don't have that much money, so it's kind of expensive. I could only afford to send out one, and so all I could do was try to address just the most egregious lies, right? Oh, there'll just be crazy guides. No, there'd be certified teachers involved. There would be limited screen time. Little Red is going to stay open because that was something everybody was just crazy about. There will be individualized instruction, small class sizes, all the things that everybody always asks for. This is what you're going to get. And this idea that somehow taxes were going to go up, it's like, do the math, but not realizing people couldn't do the math. So having said that, money was not a problem for the other side, right? They formed a group called Stand Up for Croydon Students, and they had major funding from the teachers' unions, the NEA, and Granite State Progress, which some of you are familiar with, right?
Well, they were an anti-FSP organization. Yeah. That's what they do.
So anyways, there was a flood of signs. There were yard signs. There were billboard-sized signs. There were signs on the sides of trucks that were parked everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't move 200 feet in any direction without seeing, we stand up for Croydon student signs. And they actually ran television commercials, which were kind of startling. We're like, really? But they also had all the media support was completely one-sided, right? NHPR, national media like Forbes, and there was actually an article on the front page of the New York Times about this, which leads to
this. Yep. So how this picture got taken, I was in a different meeting at the town hall, and there was this guy kind of poking around, and came up to me afterwards, and he's like, "Are you Jody Underwood?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "I want to get a picture of you for the New York Times article about the Croydon budget thing." And I was like, "Oh my God, I haven't done my hair, what I'm wearing." And so I'm actually wearing an anarchy shirt here. Just so happened. And so he took dozens and dozens of pictures of me in different spots, and, let's go outside. Let's wait for dusk. Let's set up a light thing. I mean, he just went on and on and on until he got one where I wasn't smiling. And that's the one they used. This picture right here. I made it my profile picture on Facebook for a while. I thought that was pretty sweet. It's unbelievable to me that that's what they do, right? They want to make you look your worst. Yeah.
So what was so frustrating about all this, looking back, is the whole discussion just ended up being framed in terms of personality, right? Free staters bad, democracy good. And that was the whole narrative right there. Once they had that narrative in place, they did not have to discuss education. They did not have to discuss whether you should be spending $19,000 a year for a school where 10% of the kids are learning to read. They didn't have to discuss why or who should be paying for what. Why is it not okay that people on fixed incomes are having to choose between eating and paying taxes so that your kid can play football? None of that got discussed. The whole narrative was free staters are terrible, terrible people, even though there were basically 3 people at these meetings, her, me, and Bob, who were actually discussing education, right? We were the only people who were actually saying it's not fair to the kids or the taxpayers or society to have these kids growing up without actually being educated, and it's costing us a fortune. So, and when we could actually get a question out, it was immediately, the superintendent especially would say, that's too philosophical to discuss. We have to do something practical, or that's not a serious question. As if, a question like what's more important than kids learning to read is not a serious question, as if that's philosophical. And we ended up getting the New York Times piece. We were getting anonymous hate mail and phone calls, people calling us up. We hope you die. You don't understand anything. So, that was the personality. Not, I disagree. Let's have a discussion about why I think you're wrong about education. Just, you're a terrible person, and we hope bad things happen to you. So at one point, I'd given an interview with NHPR, which, You sit down, try to have a discussion with them 2 hours, and I think the only quote they took out of it was just something I sort of said as an aside, which was like, if we took the money we spend in Newport and we piled it in the street and burned it, at least we'd get heat from it. So that became... we could have a hot dog roast. That became the summary of 2 hours of attempting to talk about education, and that's sort of a microcosm of this. So anyways, they asked me for a second interview, and I declined, and I said, I'm realizing how much of the coverage of this has been about personalities, and as a result, how little has been about the actual issues, and I don't think I want to contribute to that trend. So her response is like classic. Well, once Croydon decides what's happening with its school, I do intend to do a longer story diving into some of the issues about public education spending that you and others are raising. And I'm like, wouldn't the time to do that be before they make up their minds? This whole thing has been turned into a sporting event instead of a reasoned discussion based on the way it's been covered by the media, especially you. And she just had no response to that. So suddenly, once they discovered we could have that special meeting, there was a lot of interest in people going, wait, I have to register to vote. After people who would never vote, who had lived in town for 20, 30 years, never voted, suddenly they had to vote. But here's the thing. The statute that allows that meeting says that only the people who were registered at the time of the original meeting can vote in the second meeting. And so the supervisors of the checklist in town, they were like, so people are showing up saying, I want to register. And they're like, great, we'll add your name after the special meeting. That's what they wanted to do. So next. And so, oh, man, that was supposed to be, it is crossed out. Okay. So one of the most amazing things I've ever experienced, they were bullied into adding the new names, to updating the checklist. And that was by officials from the Attorney General and the Secretary of State's office. So there's this conference call, which is recorded. And at the beginning, they say very, statesman-like, we're here to apply the law as it's written, not as we wish it was written. And then 15 minutes later...
Sorry. This is the AG's office.
Yeah.
And you didn't say that.
I did.
You did?
Secretary of State and the Attorney General.
Okay. Sorry,
there were like 2 officials or 3 officials from each of them on this call with our town moderator, our town clerk, the supervisors of the checklist, and some of the people who had petitioned for the meeting. And so later on in the call, somebody points out, there's this thing that says they can't use the older or new registrations. And the state officials are like, well, you can ignore that. It's obsolete. And our town moderator, who's a lawyer, is like, I don't see how we can just ignore a written statute. And they were like, don't worry about it. It's obsolete. Add the new people. And so basically, they're what they were saying was, we don't care about the intent. We're nullifying the clear intent of the statute. And the number of voters went up by 20%. And so that was just sort of a symbolic of the whole thing, that the ends justify the means. Whatever they have to do to get what they want was okay.
So now we move to the special meeting. We woke up thinking there was no way they would get a quorum, right? All those people are going to stay home. I went to watch, and there were more people in this room that has ever shown up to a Croydon election that took the entire day in written history. It was astonishing. Residents were being bussed in, right, being picked up and brought over. Some people clearly didn't know what they were voting for. There were signs telling voters how to vote, and there were people coaching voters as they approached the ballot box. If you look at the NBC docuseries, you can hear a voice saying, vote yes if you want the $1.7 million budget. I mean, this is and that person turned into our state rep. How about that? She capitalized on this to run. She didn't win in Croydon, by the way, which I just thought was interesting. So all blatantly illegal, but nobody seemed to be caring about the law anymore, right? Okay, so then Bob, remember Bob on the school board, not his real name, he got up to explain the $800,000 budget and did a presentation about it because he thought that people should know what they were voting against, right? And in the middle of his presentation, he was interrupted by a shout from this math teacher with a point of order, and he's not supposed to be talking about this, and so on. And he went into a diatribe, obviously intended to derail the presentation, which he succeeded. The presentation was allowed to continue because he was exactly right in doing the presentation. But I mean, this guy is just amazing. In further interactions with him, it really became clear to me that he and others were coached on how to not listen to things they don't want to listen to, and to not let other people listen to what he didn't want them to listen to. So the training was astonishing. All right, so in the end, as was widely reported, the vote was 377 to 2. Right, in favor versus against, and I wasn't one of the two. But there were 300 registered voters who didn't show up. And if they had been in favor, they would have been, because they'd have had somebody pick them up in front of their house, right, to take them to vote. So therefore, they were actually against the $1.7 million budget, but no news media reported that, and nobody questioned only having 2 negative votes. And how do you look at that and say, yes, the whole entire town when 300 people weren't there? And I mean, I'll have you know, though, I think it was probably 2 people who contacted me to ask if there was going to be a secret ballot at the meeting, because they had been bullied into signing one of the original petitions to get this meeting to happen, and they didn't want anybody to know how they were going to vote.
I wasn't at the meeting because I figured it really wouldn't help if I was there. But I was, again, asked by NHPR for my thoughts afterward, and I thought about it, and here was my reply. I know you're not going to write it, but I hope some journalist writes a story about the object lesson presented today for the benefit of Croydon's children. If one person uses the threat of force to take money away from one other person who doesn't want to give it to him, that's robbery, and it's bad. But if 380 people use the threat of force to take money away from 300 people who don't want to give it to them, that's democracy, and it's good. I wonder how you're supposed to raise moral children in a society that operates this way. And of course, I never heard back. So we're at the discussion part now. So we're going to start with looking back, right? So we look back and we're like, oh my God, there are things we could have done differently. But as you listen to this, if you're thinking there's something, you guys should have done this, tell us. It'll be on tape. We can use it. And so we're right where we want to be. Okay, so the first thing is we should have realized it might work. I mean, I went in there not thinking. I just wanted to have a discussion. I just thought we should have a discussion among these people about what the hell we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it, But it actually happened, and then you're like the dog who caught the car. And some things that follow from that is, if I thought it was going to work, I should have had a narrative ready that this is about the kids, which was the narrative we were trying to push. This is about the kids. This is about society. This is about what it is that public education is supposed to be for.
But instead, we were always on the defensive.
Yeah.
And that didn't work. We just absolutely needed a narrative.
Yeah. Looking back, the first thing I thought of was we should have got a non-free stater to make the motion. I think this whole thing would have gone completely differently if an old timer from town, somebody who'd lived there forever, had stood up and said, enough is enough. Let's stop doing this, okay? Because then it wouldn't have been. You can't say, oh, you're just a free stater. It's like, I've been here longer than you. So you can't, that wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, we should have also had a plan for that budget, for the $800,000 budget, so we wouldn't have had to do this thing in public, right? At least something to start with.
Yeah, I mean, it just created a lot of uncertainty. This can't happen. What are we going to do? We're all going to die. And so even to say, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what you can do. This is what other places do. Just to have something, a life raft for them to grab onto.
We should have engaged more with the town. One mailer wasn't enough. Like they had multiple. It worked for them.
Yeah, we could have, even without more mailers, looking back, I think I should have held just a town meeting and just said, let's talk about education for a night, and let's talk about school spending, and let's talk about how taxes actually work, because people don't really understand that.
Yeah, we overestimated the ability of the townspeople to reason logically, but of course we know you need a story and you need emotion, and we didn't have that in there.
So there's an old joke. A lot of you have probably heard it, right? Adlai Stevenson was running against Eisenhower for the presidency, and somebody came up to him after a speech. He said, Mr. Stevenson, you'll have the vote of every thinking person in the country. And he said, that's not enough. I need a majority. So that was kind of what happened here.
Yep. We underestimated the funding the other side would have, and we were completely unprepared to get that. Things got so personal and against us.
Yeah, I mean that was just really a shock. I mean, it's one thing for people to yell at you, but they were accusing me of somehow, embezzling money from the town. And if you've ever been on a select board, that's not possible. This was funny. They accused us of moving stone walls on the road where we live when we were like making the road better to travel, and we didn't do it. But it turns out when they sent people up to actually investigate, the husband of the woman who made the complaint had actually moved some stone walls
On our road.
on our road,
Yeah.
doing
And-
some logging, and so he was going to get his ass in a sling, and
So
they
they
just
shut up
backed off.
after that. Yeah, totally. So that's our looking back, what we should have done differently.
Anybody else have any? What should we have done differently, in hindsight? Yes.
So I'm not 100% sure, but we've had a couple of situations here where the Free State movement has been attacked for actually suggesting good governance, better ideas. It seems to me like we ought to have some sort of ready program, to jump on these types of things. I mean, we didn't really have a good response for Croydon. We didn't have a good response for Gunstock. We got raked through the mud on these things. And they now have their game plan. We need to have ours. And I think it's some sort of ready room, some sort of, group that says, okay, we're being attacked here. We're going to be outspent. We know their tactics. They don't have particularly intelligent tactics. We know what they are. So how do we work this through? So I think we just need to say, this is going to happen again. Let's get ready.
Yep.
Yeah.
This and something like it. Thank you.
So we all know litigation costs a lot of money, but filing a legal action for an injunction can be done for pretty short dollars. If this was as egregious as it was described, which is shocking, would that have been something you could have considered to get a temporary injunction to prevent this from happening with a filing?
That's possible, yeah. If we had some kind of complaint, we could have put that off until it was basically too late. That's a really good idea. Thank you.
I was really sad the first thing you said was we should have had someone else speak, not a Free Stater. Before I moved here, one of the reasons I moved is I was part of a group fighting a different school board with over 100 buildings and a $2.8 billion with a B dollar budget. And our group would only put forth speakers who were minorities because we knew they were the only ones that would be allowed to speak. So I would hope here in New Hampshire we don't apologize for who we are, and we have the right to speak for ourselves. So please don't say that.
I mean, no, I totally
that
get
really
what,
bothers me. Yeah.
I totally get what you're saying, and it's just in this particular instance, given that as a tactical move, I think it would have been the smart thing to do. At the last Porcupine Day, Jeremy Kaufman made an appeal for people, Free Staters, to just stop apologizing for who you are, and I think it's good advice going forward. I'm just saying if I could get in a time machine, I would have done that.
I guess what I see is like it was like so much that the loss was they were blinded, like, oh my God, it's cut in half, and they just went full bore, like we have to restore it all. And that was a shame. So I guess my thing is sometimes incremental change, like if you went and said, hey, let's expand this for 2 years, like not the high school kids, and I know it's not what you want, but to integrate it in smaller pieces so that they're fighting for it as when they see how successful it is.
I mean, this is one of the places where Jody and I disagree. She has often said, yes, we should have done it a little at a time. I don't believe in incrementalism for a lot of reasons, and I'll be happy to discuss that with anybody. In fact,
It'll be in the book.
It'll be in this book, and there may be another book on that. But the fact is, the school board, and Jody can talk about this better than I can, the school board had been trying to incrementally rein things in, and it doesn't work. And one of the things that was interesting about this was everybody described it was frustrating to me. They described it as a cut. You cut the budget. You slash the budget. It says, no. The point was we chose a budget so that you would have to actually build from the ground up instead of looking for what could we do on the cheap around here and keep doing business as usual. So for that kind of thing, I will also say this, that you know, that we've had this discussion about the Overton window, and people weren't ready for that. But here's what I took away from that. I wrote an 8-page pamphlet. Some people read it in 20 minutes, and it changed their minds. Nobody, I guarantee you, nobody walked into that room except me thinking this was going to be a good idea. And more than half the people, having read it, just said, you know what? You made a good argument. It doesn't matter how much we spend. Here's the data. So...
Right. Before we go on, I mean, we also have a looking forward thing because I think this could keep going, and we have less than 5 minutes right now. So let us give us some of our thoughts about looking forward, and then we'll take some more comments.
Then we'll stay as long as anybody.
Yeah.
lets
And we
us.
can keep talking at the authors table after this too if you want. We're here for the rest of the
Is that
day.
your car out there?
Yeah, we get it 5 extra minutes, you said, right?
This says our 5 extra minutes. Okay.
Okay. Do you want to?
So looking forward, right? I still believe Croydon is a mess, although I have a fun plan that we'll talk about next year. But I think preparation is, you want to do this slide. So with preparation, this could work, right? So one thing for everybody to understand is that a traditional town meeting, anybody can change any number in a warrant article. You can't change the purpose of it, but you can change the number. You can pick any number you want, and if you can get people to agree with it, you can do this. So you don't need legislation, right? You don't need the state house to do anything. You can walk into a meeting. You can make this work.
Wait. You need to have somebody second it in order for a discussion to happen, whether it gets voted on or not. Just a second gets the discussion.
Yeah, so you need 2 people. Although grandfathering actually violates the 14th Amendment, and it's generally a terrible idea. As Jody pointed out, people regard this as fair. The seniors won't get to graduate from their school. That was a very powerful, if irrational, rallying cry. And you have to be ready to handle it. You have to have an answer for you know what, it's sort of like slavery, right? Well, let's just let some people keep slaves until they die, but the new kids won't. The new people, they don't have to be slaves. If you apply it to any other place, it just doesn't make sense at all. You will want to, being who you guys are, you'll want to use logic and data, but the other side is going to counter with emotion. And so you need to be ready to use all 3. And what we've taken away from this is you have to have stories that you use to convey the logic and the data. You can't just present those things naked. You need to have poster children lined up, right? In Croydon, the emotion, we just didn't have the emotional appeal, right? A student, a parent, a taxpayer. Ideally, if you can get somebody who's an education insider, somebody who's been a teacher, somebody who's been a principal or an administrator, to stand up and say, yeah, what all these people are saying is right. This doesn't work, and we need to do something different. That would be, whatever you do, they're going to try to sell sob stories, and you have to have stories that are sadder than their stories. And so the final thing is, whoever sets that narrative wins, and so you have to have that coming out of the gate. We allowed this through just not really understanding what was going on to be about Free Staters trying to cut taxes when it was really about trying to get a quality education for kids, which just happens to cost less rather than more. But it became all about the money and not about the kids at all.
Right. We hadn't taken the AFP Grassroots Leadership Training course yet. And now we have. We're starting. Yeah. So more comments now. That's the end of our comments. Yeah. Oh, well, except for this is all going to be a book, bare minimum books. I can do that just for fun. But yes, please, comments.
Hi, just a couple quick comments. One of my suggestions is don't use the word ransom again, because even though, intellectually, when you explain it, it kind of makes sense, but to average people, it sounds pretty radical and kind of fanatical. So I would stay away from calling it a ransom.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, just the story behind that is the previous year, and this is in the minutes of the previous year's meeting, is I actually stood up at the end after everything was done and said, I think, school board, please, from now on, would you use the word ransom rather than budget? So it was coming.
Yeah.
So we're done. We're out of time.
Okay.
But we'll hang around and talk to anybody.
Talk to us. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
We got some standing ovation people. I know the people just waiting. All right,
Jody and Ian Underwood, everybody. Keep it going for them.